revelation of God to not only Moses, not only to Moshe Rabbeinu, but to all the people of Israel. For they all hear his voice. Okay? Now, at Sinai, when we talk about the Torah, which is not necessarily, even though Moses gets the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, he pins that down as God tells him to. But really, Shemot, Exodus, Bidmar, Numbers, Vayikra, Leviticus, and Devarim, Deuteronomy, are actually part of whose law, right? So when we get to Sinai, all of a sudden, who does God speak to? Does he speak to all humanity?
At that point, he's talking to everyone who's there present.
Okay. Then the next question is, when he speaks the 10 words, because that's what they're called Yom Devarim. They're never called mitzvot. They're never called commandments. They're called Yom Devarim, which means these are like the 10 central ideas or thoughts. That doesn't mean, by the way, that's the end of all of them.
Right,
it's like these are the 10 central thoughts. And some of the great sages have said, the Sage Gaon, for example, said that all the 603 can actually fall under the heading of one of those 10 because of the 10 central ideas. But let's just take the very first few words.
Okay.
When God starts speaking to Israel, what's the first few words he says to him? I am the Lord your God who brought you out.
Who brought you
out of the land of bondage. You're no longer slaves. Okay? Now, he's not speaking to all humanity here, folks.
That's right.
He's speaking to one particular group of individuals that we know eventually it becomes known as B'nai Yisrael, or the sons of Israel. Right? So if he's given all his commandments to B'nai Yisrael, where's the non-B'nai Israel at? Do they have any laws? A video on YouTube that we had recently looked at, and his assumption was, okay, if these 7 laws existed, then the Jewish people would be accountable for them also.
Well, yeah, I mean, they are.
Exactly, they are. But his idea was, well, they're not accountable for them.
Of course
yes,
they are. That's the minimum requirement of any human being.
Exactly. That's the minimum requirement for a human being. The minimal social law requirement for any human beings or for a nation per se.
So if a member of Israel chose to ignore the Torah, he's still liable for the 7 laws given to mankind that are within the Torah, even if he doesn't choose to acknowledge the Torah at all.
Yeah,
so he's still responsible for that.
He's still responsible for those regardless. Doesn't make any difference. I mean, he's responsible for all, but he's still responsible even for that.
At the most minimum point to keep his life with the judgment of God. Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. He's still responsible for the bare minimum. It doesn't make any difference whether he accepts, the whole Torah itself. He's still responsible for the bare minimum. And society at large is responsible for the bare minimum, whether they actually know him or not.
But that's based back again at the point of the flood, which that's what they were judged for, not keeping the minimum requirements of humanity.
Right, but
that's the only reason why that's the minimum to begin with.
But what we'd really like to point out is that if we look at the Torah, and we're going from Shemot to Devarim, right? From Exodus to Deuteronomy, 4 books. Those were books and laws within those books, that were given particularly to the people of Israel.
Correct.
Right? In other words, God brings these people out. There's one little family of Noahides, because everybody is a Noahide until that point in time. Until Sinai. Everybody's Noahides. And so God takes one little family of Noahides, and he sets them apart from all the other Noahide nations or clans, and he says, I'm going to make you different. You're going to be B'nai Yisrael.
So
and those laws that he gives them is going to make them different.
We're going down the road like this, and all of a sudden we come to a fork.
Yes.
Abraham goes this way, the rest of the world keeps going the other way.
Exactly.
Their laws pertain to them. The rest of what was added pertains to the line of Abraham.
Exactly. So you have that Abram family, you know, that one little, it's a Noahide family, because Abraham's a Noahide. But all of a sudden, Abraham gets an additional commandment, right? And that's the commandment of circumcision. Jacob comes along and he gets the additional commandment of not eating the Sinaitic nerve,
Right.
which is included later on in the Torah, by the way. And then when we get to after they come out of the Exodus and they come to Mara, they actually get 3 more additional commandments, and that commandment is honor your parents, right? Specific commandment. The other one is to establish courts of justice, and the other one's the Sabbath, right? So you actually have 3 more that's added on. So all of a sudden we go 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But that's for a specific family, right? Because God's going to separate this family of Noahs from all of the other families. Why? Remember what we said all the way back in Genesis. God says, yeah, I know Abraham. I know he will teach his children and his household the ways of Hashem. And so that lineage of teaching is continued down through that family line until we get to Mount Sinai, which is an expansion of Abraham's family, right? Fully expanded now to about 2 to 2.5 million people, and all of a sudden they are set apart from the rest of the nations. Why are they set apart? Because they are to be priests to the rest of the nations. In other words, they have a responsibility. You know, a lot of people think.
And it's the whole group.
Exactly, the whole group.
It's always mentioned in that format. The whole group.
Israel.
Yeah.
Israel has responsibility.
Not one individual, not two, but the whole.
Exactly. So, you know, if you're going to make somebody priest, then just like Israel has a priest system within itself, well, the high priest, the Kohen HaGadol, you know, has more responsibility. In other words, he has more commandments, more mitzvot to keep than anybody else. Right? So Israel becomes a priesthood to all the nations. Therefore, they wind up with more laws, more responsibility, which enables them to perfect themselves in some way to a greater degree because of the keeping of the commandments. But we don't have any of these laws until Mount Sinai, which is 2,448 years from the time of the creation of Adam.
Right. It goes right back to the very beginning of the point. What was being practiced at the time?
Exactly. What is in that span of 2,448 years? Okay, we've alluded to some things. Yeah. Right? We can actually go to Bereshit, back to Genesis, back to the written text, and we can actually see, as we pointed out, you know, the first round of creating man, as we call it, the first story, which is kind of a general story. And God tells man, you're allowed to eat of every green herb that bears seed within itself. You're allowed to eat of every fruit tree that bears seed within itself. So that's a permission thing, right? He's not permitted eating meat at that time, by the way. Not even, you know. And then we get to the fact once we get through the general story, and we get to the more informational story about the creation of man, how he actually forms and breathes the breath of life into him, takes him and places him in this the garden in the east of Eden, and we call it Gad Eden, the Garden of Eden, and there he's informed in this garden, in this particular place where God had positioned him at, that out of all the trees that were there, he could eat, and he could eat freely. But of that one tree, which is referred to as the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that he had to abstain from that. In other words, he has a prohibition. Right? Okay. Now, what we want to do is go back and take that 2,448 years and look at the fact, number one, we do know. There's facts that we do know, I guess, if we could count them. Okay. Fact number one. Fact number one, we know that God judges people.
Right.
Okay? Fact number two, we know that God determines that some people are worthy of His grace, while others are not. We know that God determines that some people are actually righteous, and some are not. Okay? So, our question should be, How does he make those determinations?
Based on what?
Yeah, if Hiram was living prior to the flood, you know, we'll say you were back during the time of the flood, and God looked down at Hiram and said, well, you know, Hiram's a pretty good guy, so I'll just give him some grace. Right? Or, you know, well, Hiram seems like, I'll call him righteous. You know,